if an adversary is going to spend a day or a week on a system, how much money is defense spending to accomplish that? Generally speaking, I think defense is spending 1,000x of what the adversary is, and that's the problem. If we can somehow make new solutions, new ways of doing things where it costs them $1,000 of time and energy to defeat $1 of defense, then we've made some ground. Not until.
You are listening to The Secure Developer, where we speak to industry leaders and experts about the past, present, and future of DevSecOps and AI security. We aim to help you bring developers and security together to build secure applications while moving fast and having fun. This podcast is brought to you by Snyk. Snyk's developer security platform helps developers build secure applications without slowing down. Snyk makes it easy to find and fix vulnerabilities in code, open source dependencies, containers, and infrastructure as code, all while providing actionable security insights and administration capabilities. To learn more, visit snyk.io/TSD.
Hello, folks, and welcome to another episode of The Secure Developer. I'm super excited to be here with you again today, especially because of our guest. I have not shared this in the past, but I go way back to the days of early AppSec and OWASP at Watchfire. And back in those days, I had some really good friendships, one of which was with the CEO of WhiteHat Security at the time, who is a founder, a figurehead in the application security space, and that is Jeremiah Grossman. Jeremiah, welcome to the show.
Danny, we've recently reconnected after a long time. It's really great to see you. And it does remind me of the old days and how new and fun that world was.
It was radically changing the industry at the time. I think OWASP, the Open Web Application Security Project, had just started, and you were involved with that. Is that right?
Yeah, there's different versions of the history, but I believe, if memory serves, there was like a 2002, 2003 founding, and I remember distinctly how it was founded. It was fairly organic.
Yeah, and the community was a huge thing. I remember the OWASP gatherings and Black Hat and all the events in those days, and everything was hackable. There was nothing that was secure, if I'm remembering correctly. I remember we had I think about a 96 or 98% penetration rate in vulnerabilities in web applications.
Yeah, I mean, it was a time where every form field had a SQL injection. Every parameter had a cross-site scripting issue with it. And, at the time, all of InfoSec was transfixed with firewalls and antivirus. And we paid no attention because we could pretty much hack whatever we wanted with our browser.
Yeah, so it ended up, I always said, it comes down to two things that we need to understand. One is input validation. The other is output encoding. Have we gotten any better as an industry over the last 20 years?
Oh, I think we've made huge gains in one is on the awareness side, but also on the frameworks. I just remember back then, you could touch any website and literally find ODBC error messages indicative of SQL injection everywhere. Now it's findable, but it's different. No one did output filtering because what is this cross-site scripting thing? Why do I care about the client? So every website was riddled. Now, different frameworks from Microsoft or, whatever the case may be, Node.js, it's just not the same. You actually have to work for cross-site scripting now.
Yeah, I always say that the way that we eliminate classes of vulnerabilities like buffer overflows was to go to managed languages. The way that you eliminate things like output encoding is you go to these frameworks that build it into the infrastructure. And as much as we like to say, hey, I'm going to search for the issue and apply a patch, the better way to solve the issue at an industry level was through these framework-based approaches. You would agree with that, presumably?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. It's better for a developer just to create a feature and not have to worry too much about security, and then those vuln classes solve themselves. At the same time, what I noticed, like when we were doing statistics reports at WhiteHat a long time ago, there was a side effect of that, though, is that developers that were leveraging the frameworks to eliminate classes like SQL injection and cross-site scripting had no familiarity with it. So when an issue came up, like SQL injection, like cross-site scripting, the time to fix and remediation rates went in the negative direction because they never had to fix it before.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that we continue to track actually now is mean time to resolution as one of the key KPIs, key performance indicators for organizations. Do you think that education and awareness has improved over the last 20 years? Are graduates coming out of computer science and electrical engineering or computer engineering school more aware of the security issues today?
Oh, yeah, I have to think so. And I have some personal stories about that. So like yourself, I go to conferences and things and talk security with people, or I'll be on stage and I'll get cornered by some, students that are either in school or coming out of school. And they were talking to me about nuanced, very high level subjects about cross-site scripting and nuances that only somebody really familiar would know. And, I would look at them and go like, how did you learn this stuff? Where did this come from? Oh, we learned it in school. You guys are in the textbooks. And I was like, they put us in the textbooks? You guys learned this in school? There wasn't even like a book on this stuff, let alone a school for this. And I'll just, beyond belief. So yeah, awareness is way better than it was a long time ago.
Well, I think you have a lot to do with that, Jeremiah. I remember you doing a talk at Black Hat, I don't know, mid 2000s, early 2000s on a cross-site scripting proxy that you used as an attack mechanism to get perpetual foothold on a victim's computer. And I was so impressed. I went back to Watchfire and built a similar engine to show our customers the impact of these things. So I think you should take a lot of the credit for that awareness that exists.
Yeah, thank you. I was just having fun at the time, twisting browsers in different directions. I was always favorable to the client-side attacks, the browser and security issues, and others would focus on remote command execution through SQL injection and other things. But thank you. It was a fun time.
Well, ironically, those client-side attacks have become even more prevalent now with front ends being so much more powerful. Applications are developed in a very different way now than they were back then, where a lot of the intelligence is happening out on the edge, if you want to use that term, in client browser, and frameworks like React have only perpetuated that complexity on the client side.
Yeah, and broadly speaking, browsers are advertising platforms made by advertising companies. And the only way to fix those classes at the edge would be to kind of redesign browser and browser security. But those models that have been devised only come at the expense of the way the advertising system works online. So there's no real fix for it, broadly speaking. That's an alignment and an incentive issue that we haven't found a way around yet in the industry.
Yeah, well, I confess to not only agreeing with you, but doing this podcast from a Brave browser because I have concerns about the mainstream browsers as well.
You and me both. I'm on Brave. It's funny, and it's one that was easy to miss. I actually tried developing a secure commercial browser way back then based upon Chromium. I called it Aviator at WhiteHat at the time, and it had all the config. It was like, what you do is you take Chromium, an open source platform, you put a few extra bells and whistles and some spyware, and you call it Chrome and other things, right? So I removed that, added some of my own security features, and called it Aviator for a variety of commercial reasons that never really got traction. I had to mothball it. But then all of a sudden, Brendan Eich, the creator of JavaScript, comes out with Brave, doing a very similar things with a different business model. And I was a big fan in the beginning. So I've been using that one for years.
Yeah. So frameworks have gotten better. Security, education, and awareness have gotten better. But the spend in security has not gone down, nor do I necessarily believe that our security posture has gotten better. Would you agree or disagree with that statement?
It depends on how you measure it. If we always got to think of the adversary. How much time and effort does it take them to find and exploit one vulnerability, which is their mission for winning? I think it's much harder than it was way back when, but it's still doable. And we spend a lot of money to increase the difficulty in terms of minutes or hours. That's where I kind of question the efficacy of what we're doing. You think about it I like thinking in terms of budgeting and money. If an adversary is going to spend a day or a week on a system, how much money is defense spending to accomplish that? Generally speaking, I think defense is spending 1,000x of what the adversary is, and that's the problem. If we can somehow make new solutions, new ways of doing things where it costs them $1,000 of time and energy to defeat $1 of defense, then we've made some ground. Not until.
Yeah, that leads me to the belief that we need a more risk-based approach, because I always tell people, I was using this analogy 20 years ago that you didn't have to run faster than the bear, you just needed to run faster than your friend, right? Which is probably the wrong analogy to be given. But it's an ROI for the attacker, and we don't think that way on the defensive side. We tend to think of, hey, I need to be perfectly secure. And so you end up spending tons of money and not actually measuring risk effectively at a business level, at a dollars level.
Honestly, it's the right approach. But I also think the reason we don't do it is because it's very hard and we don't have the tools yet for it. For example, it's still today, the asset inventory problem is not a solved problem. If you go into any organization and you try to find an asset inventory of all the websites, mail servers, DNS servers, services, what they own, what they do, how important are they, and who's responsible for it, we don't have that. So we don't know what we own. Then you have to, to do risk management, you have to know what those services are worth to you in dollars and cents terms, so you know how much to spend protecting it. We don't have an approach to go monetary value. So how do we do ROI when we don't know the assets, we don't know their value? So and how do we approach how much to spend? We don't have those things yet.
Why has that problem not been solved? Because I would argue we knew about this 20 years ago. We didn't know all of the attack surfaces, and we still don't know the attack surfaces. I live in the coding world, and the first thing that we do is we plug into GitHub, and people are shocked by the amount of repositories and code that they have because they don't have that coverage understanding. Why has that problem not been solved?
I think it's going to be hard, to try to approach the value of an asset. I think it's doable, but I think the reason we haven't really focused on it and done it is a matter of incentives. So for instance, there's a limited amount of developer resources at any company. It's not infinite. So when there's a vulnerability in a system, for example, the business has to decide overtly or implicitly, do I spend my scarce development resources creating a revenue generating feature that if doesn't get released on time will for a fact cost the company money? Or do I allocate those resources to fix a vulnerability that may or may not get exploited and may or may not cost the company money? And they have to do that with incomplete information. So if the sure thing is shipping features, that's what you do. And that's very hard to argue against because they're in the business to make money. Developers are in the business of shipping code. So we have a liability issue. And one of the central points that I point back to is the EULA, the end user licensing agreements, where all software, all services take on no warranty and no liability for the outcomes. So if the business and the software that we are licensing has no liability, what's the real incentive for them to get it right? Security. That's the problem. It's not like these are not technical problems we're dealing with. We're dealing with incentive problems.
Yeah, it is true that resources, and especially people resources, are the scarcest commodity at any organization. We always talk about develop fast, stay secure. The focus for most engineering groups is around the develop fast, not the stay secure. I was listening to another podcast, actually. I don't know if you're supposed to do this, talk about other podcasts on one podcast, but I was listening to Acquired in the Microsoft episode, and they were talking about how the most valuable resource that they had was these limited engineers to run these programs. And that is absolutely the case. And so there's a misalignment of incentives. You can spend a lot of money, but you still don't have the right people to run those programs within the organization.
If we take it just one step further in the organization, so you've been a developer, been around development groups at many different companies. Have you seen or heard of any company that rewards their developers for creating secure code or penalizes them every time they introduce a defect or a vulnerability? Is that a thing?
It's not a thing. I mean, I have seen it once or twice, but it's certainly the single digits, not even double digits across the industry. And it tends to be in organizations that are heavily regulated, where there is more obvious liability. I would argue there's liability in all organizations, but they just don't realize it until they get hit by the security breach or whatever it is that occurs. Now, you mentioned breaches and liability. Do you expect that insurance is going to help to drive change in the industry in any way?
Yes, I believe so very strongly. I'm having difficulty with the timing of it, but it's certainly laying a heavy hand in InfoSec, and it's invisible to most of that work in the industry. So, going back, I think it was like 2013 or 2014, something like that. I gave the first ever cyber insurance talk at Black Hat, and it was kind of like a warning sign that they're coming for us. Now, these days, cyber insurance is compulsory for most, if not all, businesses, especially the bigger ones. And so when a breach occurs, the insurance company is going to be left holding the financial bag. In order to get insurance, you're going to have to do what the insurance company says, whatever it is, right or wrong. So they're going to have the influence that the business needs insurance, and the only way to get it is to do what the insurance company says. That's what they are going to do. And that is going to be an increasingly heavy hand as we move forward.
I see that as a good thing, is my perspective. It's like PCI DSS. No one likes regulation, but the good thing about PCI Data Security Standard, I think we're about to come out with version 4, was that it forced practices upon companies that weren't considering this at all. And presumably, this will do the same thing at a broader level outside of the payment card industry. It will do it for all organizations that have a cyber presence.
Yeah, PCI DSS was not perfectly similar, but similar. If you want to transact credit cards, you must do what we say security-wise. You must follow these particular rules. It has some side effects because all it did was transfer the liability from the card brands, to the merchants. That's also what it really did. Very few companies in my experience that I saw lost their ability to transact credit cards prior to the breach. And that was the other thing. We kind of made fun of PCI DSS. No one was compliant after the breach, only before. That was one of the problems.
Well, one of the interesting things in the industry, I always say, is compliance is not security. Those are very different concepts for the organization. And it's important to understand that, because you might meet every letter of the law, but you still get breached and you get ransomware, and someone has to pay a lot of money or decide what to do in that circumstance.
Exactly right. So the insurance companies have very interesting data. InfoSec has breach data, like generally how the bad guy broke in and what they did, but it's devoid of financial loss data. So what the carriers have is loss data. They see all the incidents, they see what the bad guys did, and they see what it resulted in losses and why. So they have very interesting data, and I try to get as much data out of them as possible, because you give that enough time, enough incident data, we'll get to see what works and what doesn't work to reduce the losses. Honestly, the world doesn't care so much about breaches. They care about financial losses. And that's where we're going to be starting to optimize for.
Yeah, I do think money drives all of these things. And as you say, it is a business issue and a dollars issue, not a technical issue. I want to go back to something you said earlier that I think is interesting around aligning incentives, and engineers or developers are not incented to necessarily build secure code. They're incented to develop quickly and do things effectively. How do you align the incentives for engineering and development and building software? Because this podcast is for developers, secure developers. How do you align the incentives for the engineering teams? Do you have suggestions?
First, you have to get the organization to have liability, and that liability extends to the software that they produce. So one, you have to do that. But let's say that's true. I've seen it done a couple of ways. Like in the old days, we didn't have bug bounty systems and bug bounty brokers and things like that. We didn't have that as a concept. Now we do. So one of the things that I saw companies do is that they'll say, we're going to budget $500,000, $1 million to pay out bounties to find vulnerabilities in our code. And for any unclaimed bounties, those get rewarded to the developers in terms of bonuses. That's one of the ways they did it. Other companies that I wish somebody would have productized is that, just like I'm sure you've seen it in development groups, that there's a Pareto principle, an 80-20 rule in development. Some developers are just way more productive and better than others. It's just how it is. I have a suspicion that 80% of the vulns, relatively speaking, are produced by 20% of the developers. We just don't know who they are. What I would like to see is when vulnerability, whether it's static analysis, dynamic analysis, we reduce it down to the developer that committed the offense, and we do performance metrics per developer inside the organization. So it's not the whole development group. Like, you don't have a cross-site scripting problem. That one developer is responsible for the cross-site scripting problem. I think if we do that, we'll actually have better outcomes.
Yeah, one of the things I've been advocating for, we're seeing this explosion right now of AI-generated code. You can't go through an episode these days without talking about AI, but one of the interesting things is that the AI-generated code is generating code at about a 36% vulnerability rate, according to a Cornell study that came out recently. However, I think that falls into this, will ingest all the open source permissive code out there, and so it's generating the average. I think it would be so much better in those code generators if they train them off the senior developers who are 10 years into their career, as opposed to all of the developers, because you're getting the junior developers and the 20% that are generating 80% of the vulnerabilities. We could be a whole lot more effective in our use of AI if we had better constraints around the code that's going into the code generators, because right now we don't have an informed opinion over what should be used in these systems.
So yeah, I think I came across the same study you did. Basically, the AI generated code in terms of security is no different than the average. That should have been expected because the AI is learning from the average. So where we might slightly disagree, we'll probably say the same things. We would think senior developers create better code. That may or may not be true. They just might have been doing a lot longer. But if we define what is good quality code and learn exclusively on that, then it would be better. So that's probably the same things. The difficult part is programmatically, how do you identify what is the better code versus not? That's the hard one.
Well, if we could be using some of the AI to do the code quality analysis and security analysis and using that to dictate the data that's going into the LLMs, I think you would end up in a better place. And by the way, I completely agree with you. I tell people I've been generating horrible code for the last 25 years, and I'm sure I'll generate it for the next 10. So
I'm with you. Yes, I've known to code for years, but I'm proficient at breaking code. Don't ask me to make secure code. That's not going to
It's funny. I still like to write code in my free time, but not production code. Just to be clear, I've stayed out of that world now for the last decade. So,
but I think that'll go a long way. I can't imagine a world where AI generative code will substantively replace the developers that we need. We're just going to get them to be more productive. And if they're more productive at creating quality code, that's a net good thing. I can see that world coming, and I can't imagine it not coming. Then it comes down to the question is, it's going to have defects. How do we find, we're back to the same problem. How do we find and fix those quickly? Because all that's going to happen is we're going to have a lot more code.
Yeah, AI, my take on this is that AI is primarily, especially in the early days, mostly about productivity and being the assistant, right? It's not going to replace developers. It's going to assist developers to do things faster and better. Security is always the afterthought. As much as it pains me, and I'm sure it pains you, it's never something that people consider from the very beginning. So you're not going to get the benefits of security in AI for another 5 years or 10 years when people realize, hey, we're doing something bad right now by being faster without thinking about security.
And at the same time, every time we do a new tech, there's new problems, new security issues with the tech. There weren't cloud-based attacks until there was cloud. So I'm watching very close about the new AI classes of attacks, because it's more than just AI-generated code. It's the software itself runs with AI. How do we attack those systems? Like, this goes back to the early days. How do we defend against classes of attack that we don't know exist yet? That's the problem.
I think at the root, most security issues, and I'm interested in your opinion on this, come from a similar cause. The new attacks are mostly because there's an increased attack surface or new infrastructure. In other words, it goes down to identity and access management. It goes down to input validation, output encoding. It goes to the same causes of the issue. It's just as the infrastructure changes, we don't factor it into the new infrastructure that is emerging and being used by the industry. Would you agree with that?
Yes. Attacks, it's going to be difficult to say. The attacks that we know about, they always improve. They always increase. They get easier, more sophisticated, more powerful. But the solutions to all those attacks remain fairly static, just as you said. Input validation, output filtering, prepared statements if you want to do that. Those have always been the same. My cross-site scripting attack might be getting more powerful, but it's the same solution to it. Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah, no, completely agree with that. Do you think AI fundamentally changes the industry at all, or do you think it's just perpetuating an increased speed within the industry?
Good question. I think it's probably a speed thing unless anything else. Like, we had, let's use cloud, the last, let's say, platform, really good new tech that we got. all of a sudden we got cloud and we can scale up our systems up and down. So things moved a lot faster. There were some new attacks and new things to worry about in those environments. It's probably going to be the same thing. We're just going to get a lot more applications, a lot more software, a lot cheaper than before. I think one of the things that I wonder about a lot is that this has been true for a while. No one knows how any of these systems work now. We're going to have so many systems. It's so complex. How does it work? And does anybody know?
That is a real issue. I always say complexity is the enemy of security, because it used to be at one time we knew how a web application worked from top to bottom. We owned the database, we owned the DB connector, we owned all the code that went into it. And now we have these microservices, and the way engineering is often set up is that you only understand your little piece of the code. And when you cross boundaries, that is where these new security issues exist. That's certainly true for identity and access management and access controls and all of that.
Exactly. So I wonder about that a lot, how much in trouble we're going to be over that concept. Like in AI has some amount of decision making. It made that decision, it did that and not that. Why? Does anybody know why?
Well, it's one of the issues with AI in general is the determinism of the AI system, being able to trace why it happened. Even I use AI myself all the time to generate images. I'll ask for an image. I ask for the exact same image 5 minutes later, and it gives me something different. Yes. Because of the neural network, there's no deterministic model to know why a decision took place.
And so I think there's going to be issues with that later in security where we cannot determine why a certain decision was made. Let's say it was wrong, how do we make it right later in a consistent fashion? Do we know how to do that? So those are going to be things that we'll have to contend with.
Well, I certainly think that the data management going into the LLMs and AI will introduce its own security issues in the long term. I know even now, actually, here at Snyk, we're doing things like prompt injection, which is similar to SQL injection. It's just prompt injection to an LLM, right? But I think there will be entirely new categories of security that emerge. We tend to talk about things like data security posture management as being related to structured and unstructured data. I think there's going to be a whole new DSPM around LLM data and model integrity, and AI will, again, create new types of attacks, but for the same causes that we've seen for a long time.
So I don't feel confident in spouting solutions to this, not in AI, not the least of which, but this is where maybe we have a departure from the previous solutions like input filter, output filtering, input validation. Are we going to need finally new classes of controls around AI that are beyond input filtering, output standardization, things like that? Are we going to have brand new best practices?
Yeah, I think it is likely that we will end up needing those types of best practices and frameworks. So if you were federal CISO, if you get, called on to the federal government to solve the problem of security for America or the world, where would you focus your time? Are there things that you think would give a better payback than others in terms of increasing the security posture?
I hope they don't want that job.
I don't think any of us do.
I think half has to come in terms of policy. Like we have to have the conversations about cyber insurance, software liability, and things like that. There's no security controls that I could advocate that would be effective without the incentives to follow them later. So software liability would have to be a policy thing that has to be discussed. Now, beyond that, when it comes to controls, I think we have to get way better as an industry of sharing what works, and also maybe even more importantly now, what doesn't work. Because I think we're spending a lot of security dollars and time on things that really just don't work. So solutions that I like are areas, I like attack surface management. And one of the reasons for that is everybody will agree you cannot secure what you don't know you own. So asset management is huge. But more than that, I've talked to a lot of incident responders over the years. And when you find an incident, they go, well, they didn't patch that one issue. While true, it actually ends up being a superficial understanding of what took place. The reason they didn't patch is because they didn't know that asset existed in the first place. Otherwise, they would have patched it. And so when I talk to incident responders, a lot of them are saying about half of the incidents that they're responding to had something to do with the previously unknown asset, which was like, mind blowing to me. So that's one on the preventative side. The other one is, if we double our spend in security, do we expect half the breach? Are we going to reduce the breaches by half? Nah, probably not. I think we have to do a lot better at incident response, faster detection and response of a breach. Nothing, ask any pen tester. Nothing annoys a penetration tester faster than having to spend hours, days, or weeks breaking into a system only to get kicked off in hours or days. And so I think we need to get better at detection and response. Assume the breach. How fast can we kick them off the systems? Because that increases the cost of the adversary greatly. So I would separate those two out. Like, what is acceptable prevention, and how do we detect them really fast and kick them off the system? Just a case in point. There was just some articles I'm reading about Chinese actors penetrating the U.S. telecom networks, and they don't know when they can get them out. That's indicative right there. Maybe the telecoms could have done better at prevention, but now they're saying they don't know if they can ever get them out. That screams lack of detection and response capabilities.
Yeah, the framework, the NIST framework of identify, protect, detect, respond, recover is the right framework. We just haven't done a very good job at implementing that in a comprehensive way. Well, these are all very depressing topics, but I'm an optimist for the future. What gets you most excited about where we're going? I know that you're in the investment community now and you do some VC work. What are the exciting areas that you think will take us forward?
Appreciate that. So I spent 25 years as a founder operator, and I was developing great point solutions that were moving the needle, but it didn't scale well enough. And I got to a point where we have as I mentioned earlier, we have a $200 billion industry that we consume $200 billion a year of security products and services for everybody to get hacked all the time anyway. Why is that? Then you ask the question, like, if we looked at the last 10 years of breaches, which attacks impressed us? Like, we didn't know how to solve them or prevent. Very, very few. So we know what we're doing. We know what the solutions are. We just don't do them. So within all that, one of the things that I found is that in the investment community that existed for the last 25 years, with some exceptions, is that the VCs out there didn't know our space at all. They didn't know the attacks. They didn't know the defenses. They didn't know the technology, the problems. But yet these were the same people that were pre-selecting the innovative solutions that CISOs were meant to buy. And there were no practitioners around. So what we've seen over the last couple of years is many really, really good practitioners in the space making the jump to the investment world to find the next 10, 20, 50 companies that are going to replace all the old solutions. I do not think that there's any submarket in cybersecurity that's safe from disruption now. I don't think much of anything's working. So what's exciting to me is I get to see all these new founders with these new ideas that are going to disrupt the way we've done these before. And if I get to play some role in that success, that's what excites me.
Yeah, I am the eternal optimist, and I do believe that things will get better. And as you say, it doesn't happen incrementally. It happens in steps, I think, through introduction of new frameworks or disruptive technology. And so, it's an exciting time to be alive and participate in the security industry. So
our industry is massive, tremendous amounts of opportunity out there. I'm not saying it's going to be easy for anybody out there because everything's hard, but I'm just one example. You're another example of success that can be had, and I want to see others do it.
Yeah, it's definitely good to partner and mentor, and I'm excited every day when I wake up to have that opportunity. So that's awesome. Last question, and completely unrelated from the security. Are you still doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Jeremiah?
I actually added strength and conditioning training to it because I'm getting a little older now. But I do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and I have for years, 2 to 3 times a week, and keeps the skill sharp. And I do events at Black Hat every year for all the practitioners. It's super fun. I love it.
Why is it that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is connected with the security industry? I think more than any other industry, there's a lot of fighters in the security space. Do you have a thesis behind that?
I have a thesis. I don't know if it's right. A lot of us get into the security space through the hacking channels. We like to know more than just the average. We like to have superpowers, and the command line gives us that. And in the real world space, jiu-jitsu is that honest thing. You can or you can't. How do you defend yourself or beat a bigger, more aggressive, stronger opponent? And jiu-jitsu is the cheat code. So it gives you, in no uncertain terms, a superpower out there. It's a little bit of an embarrassing story for me, but 25 plus years ago when I first started, I'd been doing martial arts before then, but the first ever sparring match I had with someone was a 50-year-old woman that was twice my age, half my size. And I could not prevent this woman from strangling me to death. I couldn't do it. And it gave me, turned the light bulb on that I wasn't as skilled as I thought I was, that my size really didn't matter, and that she knew something that I had to learn that I didn't know. So that's one of the smaller things that it motivated my start. Other things motivated my continued journey. But I like sharing that superpower with others.
Well, that is, I think, an amazing parallel to our industry, the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and it's humbling. But, the great thing is we continue to learn every day, which is, why I love doing these types of activities and having conversations with folks like yourself who have been around from the very beginning of application security.
Well, thank you for that. You do good work, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah. Well, and thank you to everyone for participating and joining us today on The Secure Developer. We look forward to having you on the next time. Thank you, Jeremiah.
My pleasure. Thanks, Danny.
Thanks for tuning in to The Secure Developer, brought to you by Sneak. We hope this episode gave you new insights and strategies to help you champion security in your organization. If you like these conversations, please leave us a review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and share the episode with fellow security leaders who might benefit from our discussions. We'd love to hear your recommendations for future guests, topics, or any feedback you might have to help us get better. Please contact us by connecting with us on LinkedIn under our Sneak account, or by emailing us at thesecuredev@sneak.io. That's it for now. I hope you join us for the next one.